Thanks, Georgia. And we also have Conrad joining us. So let me just quickly introduce myself and the panelists. So I lead Nesta's work in education. And Nesta is an innovation foundation based in UK, London. We turn bold ideas into reality to change lives for the better. We use our expertise, our funding, and our skills to solve some of the big challenges facing society. Just a couple of years ago, we looked at the research, the future of skills, employment in 2030. And what we discovered is that the world is uncertain. Well, no surprises there. We all knew that. But the research was the most rigorous in the sense that it not only consulted with experts, but also used machine learning and data analytics to understand what are the implications for the future when it comes to skills and employment. And we discovered that only 1/10 of the workforce are in occupations that are going to see an increase in demand, and about 1/5 are in occupations that will likely shrink. So, what happens to the middle 70%? What sort of things should we be learning so that we can shift and shape the direction of the future? So, I'm really excited about the panel here today. Just to give you a bit of background, on this panel, we've got academics, we've got investors, entrepreneurs, researchers, and I personally have had multiple careers as a computer scientist, as an entrepreneur, as an edtech investor, and now as a person leading a charity and a foundation. So, having said that, let me first of all pass it over to Penny, who's joining us from Australia, to introduce herself and just briefly talk about why she's passionate about this topic.
Sure. Thanks so much, Joysy. So I'm a research fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University. And a key focus of my research really tries to understand the kind of tapestry of knowledge that is sort of collectively held across places and people, applications that have things like economic growth, development, the capacity for places to transition into new industries, the capacity for people to transition into new jobs, and the capacity of our world to really transition to a cleaner, greener economy. I'm also a research fellow at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University. And there I've been doing a bit of research looking a little bit more abstractly at knowledge to think about more how different representation systems and mediums allow us to think and understand things in new ways. We're also just starting to begin grasping at what we think about in terms of wisdom and how we might continue to flourish and live well as our knowledge and technological capabilities continue to grow and become more sophisticated. So I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and really excited, looking forward to discussing the questions today.
Thanks, Penny. Handing it over to Conrad.
Hi, my name's Conrad Wolfram, and my day job is as European CEO and co-founder of Wolfram Research. So we've been building computational technology for 30 years or so. Really, we believe in how computation can help decision making. And we've been pushing the boundaries of that for a long time with products like Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. I'm also the strategic director globally for Wolfram. So that's my day job. And in a sense, the evening job is to try and fix up the human. So on the day job, I'm trying to make the technology as optimal as possible so we can really use the power of computation. But I've seen this chasm open up with what we're teaching our students in terms of the AI age, in terms of how to use computation, and that particularly is maths education, and how mathematics education has kind of diverged massively and increasingly from what's really required in the real world and for the future AI age. And actually, tomorrow, I'm even launching the book you'll see behind it. So there it is, bigger. The Maths Fix in an education blueprint for the AI age. And I'm trying to map out in great detail what we should do about this, how we fix it, how we make the change, and hopefully to a better future.
Thanks, Conrad. I'm really looking forward to reading that book and the panel. Over to you, Alan.
I have to apologize. Mr. Virgin just switched me off, and we had to put some more coins back into the box, but hopefully we'll be back for the next 45 minutes. Alan Greenberg previously worked for Apple, Apple's education director, 2004, 2009. My team at Apple built podcasting, iTunes U, first generation of the App Store, first generation of apps. Initially director across Europe, and then Apple invited me to go and spend a couple of years in China. Left Apple 10 years ago, basically unemployable, so too old, too expensive, and an ego bigger than this building. Then had to reinvent myself working with hedge funds, VCs, angel investors, family offices, looking at both health, education, technology, and health tech. Today, I have a portfolio of businesses literally around the world, and I help grow and scale businesses.
Thank you. So we've got an esteemed panel here. So the first question really is, what's the purpose of education? What's the outcome that we're all looking for? And if I can ask Conrad that question.
There are many levels you can answer this on, but my most general answer is to enrich life. That's the point of education in a wide variety of ways, not just enrich ease, as in making money in your job, although that's important, but in your purpose. And in a sense, that was the reason that was given originally, or one of the reasons for universal education to occur in the UK and other countries. And I think we've somewhat lost sight of that in some areas, and we need to get back to that fundamental. And actually, even that rather sort of small description, I think, can allow us to tether answers to what our outcomes should be. And one of the problems we've been working on with respect to maths is if you look at the outcomes that you see, they tend to be very general. Like, we'd like people to think better. Well, we can all agree about that, but what does it mean? Or very, very specific. People need to know how to plot bar charts or something, which might be, important, but doesn't seem like it's missing some middle thinking block of outcomes. So re-engineering the outcomes, what we want to see in more detail, I think is a critical requirement as we see people and machines, sort of a hybrid combination of those in the future as being the critical way to make decisions and to make progress.
Just coming to Penny on this, because it's easier to define outcomes in maths, but what about in wisdom? How do you define that?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because it's quite normative in a sense. What a good life might mean, what an enriched life might mean, and I think perhaps now more than ever we do need to have a very inclusive conversation about what the goals of our education system need to be in order for all people to flourish. We've seen right now throughout all the protests recently how that has been quite divided for far too long. And so I think that thinking quite carefully about how we design our education systems, not just for young people, but as we more broadly engage in lifelong learning, given the pace of change that's happening and the possibilities that we have for directing our technology to different goals, how do we ensure that all that human ingenuity is giving us is actually bringing us the things that we really want in life? So yeah, I think it's something that we do need to think about in a much more careful, considered, and inclusive way.
Thank you. And Alan, what do you think as an entrepreneur, as an investor, how can technology be used to support the real goals of education?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the first thing I'd like to say is that I think that we need to think about education a different way. And by that, I mean, education is for 3-year-olds to 83-year-olds, and I'm being unfair to 2-year-olds and 84-year-olds by saying that. I think that there is, we live in a world now which is very much about continual professional development, lifelong learning, and whether it's formal or informal doesn't really matter. It just needs to be accessible. So, I mean, certainly technology plays an important part in that. I mean, frankly, my time and my work spends less time working with schools and universities because to a certain extent they are conservative by nature, and I said that with a small c, and they're very slow to change. But I think the innovation around professional development in almost every career, I mean, I would argue, what is the value of a degree today? I mean, it's a qualification to get your job interview, but no sooner do you actually get that employment than you have to have an opportunity of develop into that role, to onboard that person into that business, to actually develop them through their career. And that applies right the way through the professional fields and almost every area of enterprise.
Yeah, I think we all agree that the purpose and the goal of education needs to be bigger than just preparing kids to pass exam or just preparing workers for the future. The question is, how do we ensure that we're building these new skills? Like, what are these new skills that the changing world needs, and how do we make sure that we're building these skills in everyone?
I'll take a crack at that, at least from my perspective. I mean, to start with, we should look at what we're actually doing in our lives in real life. It's kind of start from real life and work back to how people could get there in education. And obviously, we're trying to project forwards as well to what people will want to do. And I would say there are a few, and so, by the way, I think that's really not happening at all in many spheres, right? I mean, even take maths, right? People are learning a very narrow set of tool sets, which were predicated on what you could calculate by hand, which is no longer the issue, because computers have, massively overturned that part of the maths process. And so we've got the wrong tool sets and they're learning them from the wrong angle. It's just all backwards, right? And so then you ask, a question I love asking people around the world is, when was the last time you solved a quadratic equation? We all learn them in school, and we're all forced through them across the world. When was the last time anybody actually did one by hand, in anger, so to speak, in real life? And the answer is not very often. And so I think you need to start from real life. Now, the difficult thing, I think, is abstracting out, in a sense, the thinking that you want the human to do, and figuring out what those look like, what that abstraction looks like, rather than just a laundry list of things to learn. Because the thing we don't want is humans competing with what computers do best. We should be stepping on top of the power of computers, not competing with, the fact is you can look anything up on a computer. Memorizing things is something computers do, in many ways better than we do. There's no point in that. What we need to is go to level up the imagination, the creative skills, attached to what the computer can actually do. Final point, I do think that there's this idea that the vocational and the conceptual should be very separate. The intellectual somehow is disconnected from what you actually need. I think this is complete nonsense nowadays, increasingly nonsense. Most of the sort of things that are unconceptual are going to be taken over by computers if they haven't already been taken over. So actually, the vocational for humans is ever more conceptual. The intellectual is what you need in your job and in your life. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. So there's no division between those, I think.
Thank you. So definitely focus on skills like creativity, empathy, imagination, the things that computers can't do, and try and bring the vocational and the academic together. Those are some key things. Just to get Penny and Alan's views as well on this.
I completely agree with you, Conrad, about thinking and starting from real life. And I think if we reflect on the most nitty-gritty problems that we're dealing with in real life today, they tend to be quite complex. COVID is the obvious one to think about right now, but 10 years ago, the thing that really brought the world to its knees was the great financial crisis.
Yep.
And, arguably we could have learned a lot of lessons from that, but I don't think we did enough learning as a result of that. And of course, in the next 10 years, how we grapple with climate change is really critical, because the next 10 years really is the make or break decade in which we can either learn to do things differently and transform our economies, our societies, our industries, or not. And failing to do so has really horrific consequences. And so I think when we think about these sort of big complex problems and our difficulty perhaps grappling with them, in part because of the way in which we are educated to think, and I completely empathize with the way that we learn maths, doesn't particularly lend itself to dealing with. I mean, we're quite good about thinking about linear things, and perhaps if we had a more intuitive, engaging maths education, would be better at thinking about non-linear dynamics. But the truth is, you know, the world just had a crash course in exponential growth, and a lot of us were sort of like catching up. So I think starting from real life, I think actually complexity, complex systems, and the principles and the dynamics, and allowing people to think about those in more intuitive ways is quite fundamental. Even I think the way that we talk, the language that we use is quite linear. It's hard for me to express, you know, positive feedbacks in the way that I talk to you. Diagrams help, and simulations are even more helpful. And so starting to bring these alternative tools that have largely been relegated to as quite a small part of the population, and asking whether do we need a more broad-based education in the way we think about dynamics, simulate logic, how we're thinking about the world in forms that we can actually show people, you know, this is my model of the world. This is what my policymaker would like you to think when they're proposing some policy. Let's test it. Let's play with it. Let's actually engage with this in a more applied, concrete form. So I think personally, this is a huge skill that we need to build in the future.
Thank you. More playfulness, more visual representation, more simulation and experimentation. I like that. Alan, your thoughts on it?
I find myself strangely agreeing with everybody.
That's unusual. Come on, you've got something to add.
Joanna Shields made, in the opening keynote yesterday, she made a comment which I think is particularly interesting about technology needs to start working for us, not the other way around. And I think there is a tipping point that we've experienced over the last 10, 12 weeks, which I think is significant. Quite where it leads us, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure anybody actually knows. And, you know, Charlie has set us the challenge of what is the world in 10 years' time. I think if most people probably don't even know what the world's going to be like in 5 months' time. But, I mean, within the context of that, I think it's really interesting in terms of what I tend to look at, which is the personal learning journey. I think that we're in a world now of consumers. So rather than building education technology or teaching processes for administration, I think we need to look at the consumer. And everyone is different. Everyone's got their own personal learning journey. My son was privileged. He went to Cambridge, then Oxford. He's now a barrister. His father is perhaps not as bright and articulate as he. So my learning journey will be completely different. His is a straight line. Mine is convoluted. I need to read things 6 times and it takes me 10 times longer, but I'll get there eventually. So it's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of that learning journey. And the point I'd like to make is, and we'll move into maybe some more detail on the technology side, but can I give a brief example? I was involved in a project over the last couple of years in stem cells. So basically, there's 35 years of research in stem cells, which most people have never read, and is written in a language that most people can't understand. And half of it's not particularly good, but half of it is actually really good. And then you're challenged that almost every single doctor in the world, every GP, every practitioner was not taught about regenerative surgery and stem cells when they went to medical school or university. So how do you educate that cohort? And it's very interesting because it's not that difficult. You can take research, you can disseminate it into consumable media, you can segment it, make it modular, you can add AI behind it, add contextual search to it. That's relatively easy. But what is also interesting is that there's also an assumption that when you provide that information to doctors, the other assumption that backs it up is that doctors are clever and patients are stupid. And of course, in the world we live in today, that's not necessarily true. Is that, God forbid, you've got a member of the family with leukemia or a serious blood disorder, you're going to become an expert quite quickly, which I think goes to Penny's point. So you have intelligence on the lay side and maybe a lack of knowledge on the professional side, and how do you match that up? I talk about that as being a personal learning journey. And I think as much as it applies to the example I've given you, I think it almost applies into almost every single sector of enterprise, business, professional training, teacher development, etc.
Could I just add a couple of comments to? I mean, I totally agree with everything. Again, we're rather an agreeing panel, which I'm again not my natural state.
You and I here to argue, you know that.
I know. Well, you'll have to say something dumb then.
Okay.
Look, I mean, this whole thing about how you learn needs to be much better built in. And I think part of that is also understanding what the essence of a subject is versus its mechanics of the moment, as I call it.
Absolutely.
And in my book, I talk a lot about, comparisons with photography, which I enjoy, and things. It's like, is loading a film into a camera the essence of photography? Well, people thought it was, but it really isn't, right? I mean, it's just like, it just happens to be some particular manifestation. And we have the same in many of these subjects that we're training people in, where we've got confused between those two. And maths, I go in great detail to why that's the case. Back to some of what Penny said, I totally agree with the point about complexity. The tricky thing now is taking very complex situations in life and making sense of them in various ways. And what we're doing in school is mostly to strip out the complexity so people can deal with a simpler version, which is exactly missing the point. And so in a sense, we need to set things up so we don't strip out that complexity. We give people real messy, hairy problems, and that's what they can kind of work from. And that, of course, involves computers, because some of the analysis we now do in commonplace and real world, we couldn't do without computers. And so that's the cause of some of the stripping out of the complexity in education, because we're forcing everyone to do it by hand. The other thing is to bring real machines in wherever we can. And the great thing with computers, which is really exciting, you can't bring a chemical plant into your classroom. Not physically, because it's too big and messy and dangerous. But you can bring a computer in. The computer I'm using, we're all using here, is pretty similar to what you can get in the classroom. There's no divergence between the machinery there. I think that's also good. I think final thing was I was going to say about computational literacy, a term that I've started using. Because I think another type of, back to what Joysy was saying, another slant of thinking that we need, as well as sort of creative thinking, is computational thinking. And that's how I would better describe the mainstream computational subject that we need. I mean, we can call it maths, we can call it whatever. So I think computational literacy is kind of what the whole society needs so that we can make sense of COVID, information we're being given or whatever. And I think that coding comes in because I think it's a way to represent these ideas, a way to represent the models, a way to understand how you write these things down. So I think it's got a more central role than people might think.
Can I add a point, if I may? I think there's another piece of the jigsaw and something which is evolving. I mean, I'm involved in a number of projects, as perhaps you already know, but I think voice is very interesting. And I'm not talking about Siri and Alexa now, but I'm talking about context, is the ability to articulate a question and to actually get a contextual answer. I mean, I would argue respectfully, can you trust Google? Google, from my point of view, is an advertising platform. Who pays the biggest sum of money gets to the top of the list. That is not contextual search. That is not actually deep into research. But imagine a situation where a teacher can stand in the classroom and is not intimidated either by the young audience of digitally native kids sitting in front of him or her, or by the technology that he or she has to deploy, but actually can ask a question and get context.
Yeah.
If you look at publishing today, the biggest education publishing company in the world has just chucked out all its textbook. It's going on to a digital format exclusively. I think we live in very interesting times. Final point on this is that we have to take advantage of this. I mean, there's nothing like a pandemic to create opportunities in education and healthcare. Does the world need another taxi app, another platform for accommodation? I would argue not. Does it need things that you and I, Conrad, have been talking about for more years than either of us would probably like to remember? Actually, the opportunities, they're in front of us. And certainly the conversations are there. The point is, how productive are we? Are we delivering these solutions today? Can we deliver them? What does the future look like? How do we make
We can deliver a lot better than we have.
Absolutely agreed.
So the question is, what do we need to do to make that better future happen now?
Work harder.
I guess everyone might say we're already working harder. I think the biggest challenge is a lot of these things we talk about in terms of what's important is hard to measure, whereas what's easy to measure gets measured.
Okay, you make a very good point. I'll give to Penny. Can you come back to that question? Because I think assessment is a very interesting part of this.
I agree.
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question again, Joysy?
So how do you assess these things that are harder to assess? So, systems thinking or judgment or creativity. The reason why it's not taught in school is because it's really hard to assess it. And what tools or what methods exist to assess these things?
Yeah, so we were having a conversation a little earlier about a good friend of mine who's an art teacher. And for him, the traditional means of assessing things through trying to put numbers on how well a student has created a piece of art really doesn't work very well. And so his approach was more through the means of you give yourself a score. So you've created something, and the nice thing is that this doesn't have to apply to art. It's creativity more broadly. You've created something. We don't have a good rubrics mechanism to say whether that is the right thing or not, because there are many different designs that might meet a given problem spec. So you personally would give yourself a score, and then you would have to explain why. And then you'd go through a peer review kind of scenario where your friends might give your creation a score, and then they would tell you why. And then there would be a broader group discussion about what sorts of aspects collectively people appreciate it as being useful or valuable or good. The other thing, before I became an economist and a researcher, I used to be a jazz musician. And jazz is really interesting because it's one of these things where it's a mesh of creativity and logic. I mean, yes, we want creativity and improvisation, all this sort of thing, but you can't be so creative that you sound crap. So there is still this order imposed that this creativity finds its way within. And I think dealing with this tension between, yes, what is appropriate creative expression and what is actually not, like what is just so far outside that chord progression that just isn't pleasant to listen to, is something that I think we need to get better at, finding ways in which to appraise different things, that different human pursuits that may not just be, the correct answer is A.
I think you need to write a book on that.
Well, I'm, most of this discussion is music to my ears, because I'm thinking, did I cover that in the book? Yes, I did. So, and I really did.
I haven't read it, I promise.
Bring out the whole assessment question, how you assess all of these things. This interesting point that Penny brought up about the sort of connection between logic and creativity, and actually one thing I do talk about a lot in the book is the connection between process and creativity. And the idea that, when you have a completely blank canvas, it usually isn't the best way actually to get the most creative results. And so most things form some sort of process that you want to follow more loosely or more tightly. If you're an airline pilot, you follow a process pretty tightly, but then when something goes wrong, you're trying to creatively think about what to do, but following a process, and that's very helpful. But I think it's also true of doing science, doing maths, even doing art. And some of those things need to be brought out much more explicitly in education to help people, as opposed to hoping that somebody's going to pick up the process because we hadn't really bothered to abstract it out. But I think that combination is very, very powerful. On the assessment thing, I suppose I have 2 or 3 different angles in at this. One is that if you're going to have numbers, so to speak, to represent how somebody's done, have more, not fewer. So, I'm not necessarily a fan of very quantitative assessments, but if we can't get out of having numbers to judge things, don't have 3 numbers to represent, the 3 A levels somebody took and how well they did. Have a huge plethora of numbers which represent everything throughout their educational progress. And the way I think about this is, I think we need a sort of computational data set which represents, and this is true across all walks of life, right, which represents that complex situation. If you have a hospital, don't judge how well the hospital's running by asking for 5 metrics, because unless the managers are really crap, they'll manage to game the metrics to win, but that doesn't mean your hospital's doing what you wanted it to do. Same with students. So I feel like what we need is a system whereby you can question those metrics. And, if you're Cambridge University, you may have a different question from if you're Loughborough University, for example. You may have different ways to look at that data. So it's not a kind of you did better or you did worse all the time, as we have at the moment. Specifically on the content of the assessments. And again, Penny pointed out, it's this thing, as I've said often, that the number of times in business, I find that there are 5 answers to a question, one of which is right and the other 4 of which are wrong. And they're, closed-ended is virtually 0. Multiple choice questions are not what we usually have in life. We have open-ended, complex questions, and we need to reflect that in our examinations so far as we want them. And my feeling about this is there are 2 levels of this. There's taking our existing edifice of exams, assessments, which I'm not very fond of at all, but at least making those better within that confine. So for example, for computer-based maths that I've been working on, there are many ways you could make maths questions much more open-ended, much better, mark them like English essays rather than like right or wrong answers, which I think would improve things a lot. But then, of course, there's the whole much further issue of actually we don't really need to have people sitting in an exam room doing 2 hours of thing as the main way they assess stuff. We can go much better than that, particularly with modern technology. And I've sort of been trying to not think about that too much while I've been trying to get the right subject to happen in maths. But those are clearly very important things to intersect.
Thank you.
This is really interesting. I think we should all club together and form a new company. I'm mindful of four words. I mean, improvisation. Penny, I could not agree with you more. I think, creativity, great footballers, great everything comes from improvisation. Jazz, the metaphor of jazz is absolutely 100% right. I also agree that process is critical because you've got to have some process, but the process is often different for each individual. So there must be many processes, I don't know, process.
I think
to achieve that objective. I come back to something that I'm focused on, which is this personal learning journey, looking at the consumer, looking at their particular requirement. And again, I have to say I agree, going to Conrad's point about numbers, because it is a numerical equation. There are formulas, there are algorithms that could be developed, but they need to be in the abstract. They need to be, because genius comes from improvisation, from creativity. It doesn't come from sitting in a school from 9:30 in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, being picked up and having private tuition. It comes from a whole different scenario. And I do believe that learning is something that must be considered to be much more holistic than just schools, colleges, universities. Because I think there are many, many examples of young people who do not necessarily fulfill their potential within a school environment. But when they get out into enterprise, if you take examples in autism and ADHD and dyslexia of people who fulfill their potential and achieve hugely incredible achievements outside of a school, but fail miserably within our academic.
Well, it's bloody boring, some of it. That's the problem.
Well, exactly. So I mean, the point is there's opportunity, but the opportunity, I think we are at a tipping point. I do think the conversation we're having today, I have a sneaking feeling is more relevant than ever has been. I mean, I've been sitting at home for 11, 12 weeks. My phone has not stopped. And my conversations are ongoing. Again, I'm not sure I'm being productive. That's another word. But I'm certainly engaged. And again, I come back to something Rose Lucking said. She said yesterday, let me just get the quote right, pandemics have produced a giant experiment in engagement. I think she's absolutely right. And can I also just shout out something else I just listened to from Sir Ronald Cohen, who talked about education being the greatest lever. Now, Ronald Cohen is a very successful, very knowledgeable man, and he's written a book also. I don't want to compete with your book, Conrad, but he's also written a book just now. But my point is, I do think we're at a tipping point. I think there's huge opportunity. I'm extremely optimistic, and I think there's great things for us to take forward.
Thank you. So let's look at the next 10 years and imagine what sort of things, imagine that you're already 10 years ahead. Looking back, what sort of things would you have done to make that better future happen? So looking forward, but bringing it back to today, what sort of things could we actually do other than, of course, setting up our own company?
I mean, if I can go first, my own aspirations is to unlock research. I think research is a very interesting subject. I think there's huge repository. I'm working on a project at the moment with Cambridge University and NIAB to do with farming research. 100 years of research at NIAB. Very few people read, very few people know about. Farming is a huge industry. How do you fulfill the learning journey of farmers? It's done fundamentally by agronomists today. Agronomists tend to be employed by fertilizer companies. It's wrong. The systems are wrong. So what I advocate is basically authentic content and trusted opportunities to distribute. That's my focus, and I think that will come about in the next 10 years.
Thank you.
I can go next. I mean, the bigger picture here is we need to change the ecosystem of education so it can change with real life much more effectively, and particularly that the subject matter can change. I mean, right now, because everything's being driven by assessments, things that improve your chance of passing particular assessments, including computer-assisted things, they get some truck, you can get funding for those. Things that change the subject because the subject's wrong don't get anywhere. And then it's even more bizarre because the more central the subject, the harder it is to change. So maths is very, very central, almost impossible to change. An amusing counter example is religious studies. I mean, when I did divinity at school, to be honest, it wasn't my favorite subject, learning, passages out of the Bible or whatever it was. My daughter has a great time doing religious studies. It's theology, it's comparing different societies, how people think. It's changed because it wasn't mainstream. So you were allowed to mess with it. In fact, even to the point now where the humanists are complaining it's got religious in its title. Maths is right in the center, so you can't do that. But I think we desperately need an ecosystem that allows this change. And I think there's a lot governments particularly can do with this, because if you look at how companies were in the 1970s, it was very hard to start a new company. There were all sorts of barriers. You couldn't do things. And over time, mainly headed off by the US, I think, it got easier, that the conditions to start a company got, now virtually every country, even ones you'd consider very socialist, say what their credentials are for allowing you to start a company quickly. That's a thing that is expected to be a good thing in almost every country in the world. That should be the same thing for adjusting education at the same time. And I think that looking 10 years ahead, what I'd want is that we have a new mainstream computational subject from school right the way through. And one test of that is whether we have computational X, all the other subjects. Do we have computational history, computational biology? Those should be a way of thinking about all those other subjects. And if they aren't, then why have we got a mainstream maths or computation subject at all? You use English, which you learn as a mainstream subject, for all those other subjects. You should be able to use computational thinking for those subjects too. And so that's a measure. And I think that, as I see it, that the way we reform that, in a sense, can be a blueprint, because it's so far out of whack with the reality that's required. I think that can act as some kind of blueprint for some of the reformation we need of other subjects as well.
And what are some places that are already doing this, or are there any examples that we can point to?
No.
No.
I mean, to be blunt, no. No country in the world, in my view, has a modern computational subject that is not born out of assuming you calculate everything by hand. We did a project with Estonia, so they're ahead, and they had a very enlightened view. But even with Estonia, it's hard. There are lots of things. You've got to get teachers, governments, parents, everybody aligned to agree everything. And then the assessments go as the linchpin in the middle of that, but they're assessing the wrong thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of pieces. There are a lot of moving pieces to maneuver, and that's very tough in the environment. And I think we've got to get around that. And I agree with Alan. I think the COVID pandemic has given us opportunities, because what it's done is taken us out of our comfort zone in many ways, including bad ones. But I think there are some good ones too. And I think that it sort of shows us what was kind of crazy before in some places. And I think that allows us to see, actually, there's a different way to do this. I mean, for example, the idea that actually most people have access to computers in some way and can work with them. And so it's reasonable to assume they're around and help folks who don't have access to get access. It's not very expensive to do that, at least in the developed world.
I think it links back to the earlier point that Penny was making around complexity. And given that it's not just about the curriculum, it's about assessments, it's about pedagogy, it's about the organization structure. How do you align all these 4 different things to work together so that you bring about education systems reform is a bigger question. And I don't know if we have the answers.
Well, if people come to the Q&A session, we'll answer that for them.
Oh, that's a great incentive. Penny, any other thoughts or reflections? We've got 4 more minutes before we wrap up this panel and open it up.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to come back to Alan's point about unlocking research, because I think that is a huge area that does need to become unlocked. It's a system, an ecosystem that does lock up information that is hugely valuable to society. And I think the way that, journals and publishers and the whole kind of business model around that desperately needs to change if we're serious about building a more inclusive knowledge society. The fact that most papers are locked up unless you have access to some kind of university subscription is quite frankly ridiculous, particularly given that a lot of research is paid for by the public purse. So I think unlocking...
Penny, if I just tell you, it's also about language, because one of the challenges is language. I mean, again, it's really interesting working for an international company like Apple. We had arguments about the Americans thought they gave us English language. Well, they didn't. They gave us American language, and we had to translate it. So language is actually really key. Being able to understand the cultural localization challenges, communications challenges, these are huge challenges.
I'm just laughing because my book has maths, you see, with the S in brackets, because math in the US, maths in the UK, and I thought I'd make a joke out of that because it's, math as a function of the S if you're a math nerd like me, you see, but it's also combining both things. So anyway, that's just a joke about the differences between American and British.
Sorry, I interrupted you, please.
No, not at all. And then I think just finding ways to address access more broadly to knowledge capabilities. I mean, MOOCs, Alan, I know you've done a lot of work in this space, and
no, I hate MOOCs.
Okay.
And I hated MOOCs from day one, just for the record.
What do you specifically hate about? I mean, I'm actually with you, but I'm just curious.
Trying to help everybody, and has got success rates down at 7%, are a complete mitigating disaster. Okay, I mean, the education system we have, the school system we have is good. It just needs to be enhanced. Digital should complement the school, not take over the school. MOOCs is not an answer. And quite frankly, unlocking the resources of education should be done better by the universities. And there's a whole argument there I'm happy to discuss, not by platforms who think they have the answer to everything and are worth hundreds of billions of dollars or pounds, who knows.
That's another interesting conversation for the Q&A that's going to follow. Just in the last 1 minute, if you could share your 1 sentence on how could we make the knowledge that is needed, the skills that is needed, much more inclusive and accessible. So 1 sentence from each of you while we bring this to a close. Who wants to go first?
Do we do this in age order? Do we do this in age order, or?
You're starting now, Alan. Actually, I'm 50 tomorrow, so I guess I shouldn't be saying that.
Well, I thank you. But happy birthday for tomorrow.
Thanks.
Okay. I think we've just run out of time, so we will take that to the
Saved by the bell.
You have to think, and we're coming back into Q&A. So I'm going to hand it back to George.